Hey, listeners. Well, I interview some fantastic guests around the world. And this one in particular is a gentleman by the name of Ken Wilcox. Now, Ken was the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank from 2001 to 2011 before he went on to China to do some other things with the banking side of things. And our discussion was really quite cool. He talked about his experience with businesses in China. But he's actually written his latest book. He's written a management book called Leading Through Culture, How Real Leaders Create Cultures That Motivate People to Achieve Great Things. And there were some great gems that he had throughout the whole conversation. Here's one of them. Strategy speaks to the mind. Culture speaks to the heart. Listeners, I'm not going to spend any more time here talking because I think it's time for you to get into the episode and listen to those gems that Ken shared with me in that interview. Sit back and enjoy.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos.
Hey there, listeners. Welcome to another wonderful episode of the Leadership is Changing podcast. Great to have you here. I've got a great guest with me today. His name is Ken Wilcox. Ken, a massive welcome to you.
Well, thank you so much for the welcome. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Now, whereabouts in the world are you today?
I am sitting right here in San Francisco, California.
San Francisco, California. In the Bay Area or somewhere else?
No, right in the smack dab in the middle of the Bay Area.
Oh, nice. So I see from your background, you've been a CEO of a Silicon Valley bank. So how long have you been in the Silicon Valley and what's it been like being in that whole environment?
We've only been here for about 25 years now. We moved out here from Route 128 in Boston about 25 years ago, obviously to work with technology companies.
Yeah. And what was it like for you to be in that area whereby technology, innovation, things like that? What's it been like?
Well, of course, it's very exciting. You meet interesting people every day. You encounter new ideas all the time. It's challenging on the one hand, but exciting on the other. It was definitely worth the move.
I remember going there 5 to 6 times a year when I was in my global role with Hewlett Packard to Palo Alto. And then I think it's a Mountain View. I went there one day to go and get a new belt. And I went to a menswear store and they said, "Oh, is this the belt you like?" I said, "Yep." They said, "Oh, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook was here yesterday buying the exactly same belt." And I'm like, "Oh, does that make it more expensive now or what?" I don't know. But I was quite surprised that he was actually shopping in that level of shop. I was very surprised. But I think he's pretty down to earth in that sense of what he wears and things like that. And I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley are as well. There's not that flash stuff. It's pretty basic stuff.
Oh, yeah. The uniform in Silicon Valley consists primarily of blue jeans and, if you want to look a little dressy, a blue blazer.
On top of the T-shirt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Ken, you've written a couple books. And so, first of all, is there anything else more about your background? But I'd love to hear about the books very soon as well. Anything else you want to share around your background?
Oh, not really. I could tell you that I'm a career changer. I started out in life studying German literature and history and philosophy because I liked it. I really enjoyed it. I did that for about 10 years. I ended up with a PhD, but then I found the only thing I could do was teach at a university. And unfortunately, I started teaching at a time when inflation was about 12% and my raises were always about 2%. So I couldn't afford to stay in that position. I quit one day, went to Harvard Business School with no idea what I was going to do, ended up in the technology lending unit of a bank in Boston. And then I spent fundamentally the next almost 40 years providing commercial banking services to technology companies, primarily early stage venture backed technology companies.
Yeah, the sort of startup. Yeah, the startups. Yeah, definitely. And when I've been there in Palo Alto in that area as well, you go see places and you can see the startup getting underway and things like that. It's actually really fantastic to see it happening. The two books. One is Leading Through Culture, which is a fascinating topic because I love it. The other one that was really fantastic as well is the China business conundrum. Ensure that win-win doesn't mean Western companies lose twice. So tell us a little bit about both books, please. Let's start with Leading Through Culture, and then we'll go into the China one too.
Sure. I finally retired professionally about 5 years ago. And it was fortunate that I'm sort of a journalist, and I don't mean in the typical sense. I'm the kind of guy, though, that periodically, maybe every 2 or 3 days, will sit down at night and write down what's going on, not in terms of keeping a record of where I eat, but in terms of keeping a record of what are the big challenges that my organization is facing and how do I think I'll deal with them. And then periodically, I always, maybe quarterly, would take time and spend some time thinking about whether or not the solutions that I had come up with a few months before actually ended up working out or whether they needed to be changed. So when I finally ultimately retired 5 years ago, I had a stack of papers several feet high, and I decided I'd do something with them. Out of those papers came my first book, Leading Through Culture. And then about a year ago, my second book, The China Business Conundrum. That's the background there. And
The China business conundrum, that's actually quite catchy kind of title. I'm like, oh yeah, tell me more about that one. So what's it really about?
well, first of all, let me just say the original title, the title I was going to use was based on a common phrase in the Chinese language, which is one bed, two dreams, which explains why many marriages don't work that well. And it also explains why almost all joint ventures don't. But my publisher, Wiley, decided that the China Business Conundrum would be a better title. So we ended up with that. What it's all about is when I quit being CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, which was at the end of 2010 or so, we got news at Silicon Valley Bank that the Chinese government wanted us to come to China and build a joint venture bank to help them finance early stage venture backed technology companies. They said they looked the world over and found us, and we were exactly the right ones. So just when I was retiring, we got this word, and the board looked around and said, who should we send to lead this effort? And it turned out that I was the only one who was willing to go at the time out of several thousand people. So I went home and asked my wife. She said, you got to do it. We packed up and we went to China. We were there for 4 years. This is all about our experiences building this bank. And I would say the main thrust of the book, if you were to ask me to make a headline, it would be 2 sentences. Wonderful time in China, so much fun, so interesting. That would be for the first headline. The second one would be Chinese Communist Party is a very difficult joint venture partner. So in effect, this book describes all of the challenges of working with the Chinese Communist Party as your joint venture partner and offers some suggestions on how to best deal with that.
Listeners, you may want to go and get that book. That sounds really, really good. Ken, when you're talking about that and you're in China, and we're going to talk about Leading Through Culture book in a second, what did you notice about leadership in China? Is it different to other places in the world?
The answer is, of course, obviously yes and no. It's different in some respects and not so different in others. I would say that leadership is based on human nature, and human nature tends to be similar across cultures, obviously. At the same time, there are certain things you can say about leadership in China that make it somewhat different. Meaning, first of all, China is much more, every organization in China is much more hierarchical than would be true in most Western companies. And people in China will make a great show of modesty. I remember my management team, when we'd meet weekly and go around the table, and everybody would give a short update on what their area was up to. The updates usually begin with something like this. Under the leadership of Ken and with the support of my team, we were able to accomplish X, Y, and Z. But don't fool yourself. It doesn't mean that they don't want personal praise. It's a cultural phenomenon more than anything else.
I found that when I was working with teams in Asia, Even today, sometimes if we're doing like we've got top talent, there's 70 people in the room. If the Australian and the New Zealand, if we're doing an activity, the Australian and New Zealander will get up and say what they thought. Where if it was a table of Asian leaders, they would choose someone, or I get them to choose someone who would represent the table. So it was almost like a saving face type scenario whereby they didn't want to say, but it was okay for them to say it was on behalf of the team.
It's always on behalf of the team.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Now, leading through culture, I talk about leading through change. This is leadership is changing, so forth. But leading through culture, tell us more about that book. That sounds fascinating. I think that listeners, that's another definite book you should get to listen to, listen to or read. I listen to books, so that's why I say it that way.
Oh, you can listen to that one. It's all set. The China book, you won't be able to listen to for a couple of months because we haven't gotten that edition out yet. In any case, to give you just a tiny bit of background on this Leading Through Culture book, I was fortunate, I think, at the time I didn't realize it, to have a father who taught organizational behavior. He's long since passed, but he was one of the early people in that field. He taught at General Motors Institute in the now famous Flint, Michigan. When my dad started teaching at General Motors Institute, Flint had one of the highest per capita incomes in the United States, if not the world. And of course, Flint today looks a lot more like a refugee camp than a normal city because General Motors has moved on and hasn't moved on quite as well as you might hope for either. But my father when other fathers were out in the backyard throwing footballs or baseballs with their children, my father was lecturing us on organizational behavior. And in particular, he was totally fascinated with two things. One is what he called the migration from theory X leadership to theory Y leadership. And the other one was company culture. The theory X one is pretty easy to explain. Probably everybody's familiar with it. In the wake of World War II, many of the leaders of American corporations had military experience, and it carried right over into the way they led companies. But in the fullness of time, we had so many social revolutions in the United States, in particular in the 60s and 70s, people began to want more out of work. Instead of being told what to do, they began to want to participate in deciding what to do. And of course, theory Y management was much more participatory, I guess. So we learned these lessons at the dinner table, whether we wanted to or not. When I finally got out into the work world, I found out that not a huge number of companies had paid enough attention to the whole issue of the migration from theory X to theory Y, and not enough of them had paid attention really to the whole issue of culture. How does culture drive a company, and why is it important, and where does it come from? So it caused me to think about all those things my dad had lectured us on years before, and I put my mind to trying to create a culture at Silicon Valley Bank that would make people feel better about coming to work every day and motivate them and keep them enthusiastic. And I think we largely succeeded.
I actually quite like that, the theory X and the theory Y, and that the way that you've put it, because I actually think today there tends to be a lot more of that theory Y. People are wanting more, especially the younger generations. They're tending to be more that way, I think, too. So, yeah, interesting how in the 60s and 70s, but, it's now we're talking about it still again, or has it come around again? Is it like things come round and they come and go? Interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So leadership, how did you actually get into leadership yourself?
Well, or a little bit by accident. On the one hand, maybe not so much by accident, because I was one of those kinds of people who I didn't really excel at anything when I was growing up, except I always ended up being the class president or the student council president. That seemed to be the only thing that people knew me for, because I wasn't any good at athletics or at music, and I was pretty good at academics, but not astounding. So I had that as background. I really had never intended to become a CEO, though. When I got involved with Silicon Valley Bank, I always had a better idea, so to speak. I was sort of a pain in the ass because I always felt that I could do a better job than the CEO could. And somehow along the way, the board noticed me. And in the year 2001, when my predecessor decided to retire, the board actually, to my great surprise, to be totally candid, asked me to be the next CEO in line.
I was going to actually
So I backed into it.
I was going to actually ask you, what did they notice about you other than being the pain in the ass, as you said? What did they notice about you? Was there anything you were doing in particular?
Well, I think there are a couple of things they would have noticed. One was our bank was headquartered in California, Silicon Valley Bank. And the part that I ran was headquartered in Boston. Ultimately, as time went by, I became responsible for all of Silicon Valley Bank east of the Mississippi. And I really focused on building a sense of team spirit. And somehow it stood out, and people began to notice it. And people began to say, that really is something maybe we should think more about. And I guess that's probably what the board noticed.
Yeah. Yeah. In other words, the way that you worked with people, brought them the best out of them, treated them, that sounds like more what you were doing, right? And it was the all around culture again.
Yeah. I think people often make a mistake by thinking more about strategy than culture. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, strategy is the result of an intellectual exercise. You can actually hire somebody like McKinsey and Company or some smaller type organization, consulting organization, to help you with strategy. And ultimately, strategy, which is nothing more than a long-term plan, really speaks to the mind more than anything else. But culture is a totally different issue. Every company has culture, whether they intend to or not. They have a culture. Anytime there's a group of people that spends time together, a culture emerges. And that culture can be anywhere from toxic at the one end of the spectrum, all the way up to really beautiful, wonderful at the other end of the spectrum. And at the positive end of the spectrum, I think people just love coming to work. And they feel like they're personally, in a sense, to use the Maslow's hierarchy of needs terminology, they feel like they're self-actualizing. And in fact, because they are. So I've really focused on that. And it ends up, unlike strategy, which speaks to the mind, culture speaks to the heart. And I firmly believe that in general, humans are driven by their hearts to a much greater extent than they're driven by their minds. I'm not totally discounting the mind, by the way. I'm just saying it's the heart that makes you want to get up and get going.
Wow. I love that. I really do. I think that's great. Because I know there's the cliche out there that culture eats strategy and things like that. That's the old cliche. But I love what you're saying there. So strategy speaks to the mind. Culture speaks to the heart, or is that the right way of saying it, or did you use it?
Yeah, it speaks to the heart. Yeah. So we very consciously, my team and I at SVB, very consciously developed a culture that we felt was the right one. And I can give you just a couple of examples just to illustrate what I'm talking about. One thing is we wanted to have a horizontal culture as opposed to a vertical culture. Many companies are almost totally vertical in their orientation, and people spend most of their time kissing up and pushing down. And we wanted to have the kind of an organization where people reached out sideways and built productive relationships with other people. The result being that we very consciously formed what we called horizontal teams. And that meant teams that were working together to make the client successful. And that usually requires people from a multiplicity of different silos. So rather than having a siloized organization, we wanted to have one that cut sideways through the silos, and your team would consist of all the people you needed in the various disciplines. And your goals would be, number one, helping the client succeed. But interestingly enough, also helping your team members succeed, which I found in a number of corporations is not really the case. I honestly believe that in many corporations, people spend maybe half their time trying to get their work done and the other half their time jockeying for position and trying to get ahead of their coworkers. But that doesn't help clients one iota. And clients ultimately notice that, and it annoys them. And the truth is, clients are why we're there. We're there really fundamentally for three reasons. I would prioritize them. One is if you have happy employees that are feeling really motivated, that will result in successful customers that are doing well in their own right because you're supporting them. And that in turn will make it possible to provide shareholder value. But it's not only shareholders that we should be providing value to, it should be our other constituencies, which would include the community and our country, I think.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of place that we decided to build.
That's
And it really, really worked well. One of the things that people often ask about is, how do you reinforce that? Well, of course, you reinforce it in a variety of ways. One thing is that management has to walk the talk. If management is not sincere, people will notice and motivation will turn to cynicism. That's number one. Number two is you have to periodically doesn't mean once a year, it means often, discuss with your employees why we're doing things this way and what the benefit is. How does it help them? And how does it help our customers? So it has to be something that we're consciously doing and actually discussing, not just paying lip service to. But the third thing, we actually backed it up with compensation. In other words, for a long time there, when I was CEO, we had a compensation system that was was set up like this. 50% of your bonus would be based on your actual goals, but the other 50% of your bonus would be based on your coworkers' perception of the extent to which you help them do their job better. And that actually was, and I think in retrospect, I think that was an amazingly good idea.
Because it drives the behaviors in the sense that's where not just the behaviors, but that's where the focus is, right? So as you're saying before, if we keep talking about it all the time, that's what I find, Ken, is that a lot of organizations, even with strategy or values or anything, they don't talk about it. So then if they're not talking about it, they're not bringing it to life. And so what you're sharing there is some really, really important stuff here. I think it's the role model side of things, walking the talk is the number one thing. But, as you're saying it as well, the customer has got to be the focus. Yes, we as a team are looking after our people. That's all good. But, if we got great people and we've got a great product or a great service and whatever, that means nothing unless we've got a customer, right? You can have the most fanciest stuff, but who cares? You've got to have the customers. And if we don't look after them, and you're right, they do see it. They do experience it. They know what's going on as well. And customers want that organization to be successful. And so...
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. Hey, look, who's your favorite leader? Now, this person could be alive or from history. Who's your favorite leader and why?
That's a hard one to answer there. I will say that my favorite reading material is biography. And I've read tons of biographies, mostly of people that were well known for having played significant roles. And I do think that those are instructive. You learn a lot about what constitutes good leadership and what constitutes leadership that is less than perfect. But I would say if I had to pick one, I would probably pick Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, for a couple of different reasons. One is he was humble. I think good leaders are humble people. I don't mean self-deprecating. That's something we all do to be humorous, but genuinely humble. He respected other people. That's, in my book, the definition of humility. He did have a good sense of humor, by the way, but I'm not sure that's the most important aspect. But he was also brave enough to deal with differences. Most people try to ignore differences or sweep them under the carpet, pretend like they don't exist, or crush them with edicts. But good leaders actually solicit opinions from other people. And to the extent that those opinions end up being different, they don't dismiss them with disrespect. They question themselves. Is the person who's disagreeing with me maybe offering me something that can help me make better decisions? And if not, can I at least respectfully disagree with the disagreeer without crushing them or making them feel dissed? And Lincoln was well known for that. You probably have heard of I think one of the most famous Lincoln biographies was written by a woman named Doris Goodwin, and it's called Team of Rivals. He allegedly selected cabinet members who had different points of view to make sure that he was making the best decisions possible. Whereas some leaders want to avoid any and all opposing opinions. They make their decisions in a vacuum, and invariably they suboptimize. Their decisions aren't as good as they would be otherwise. Make no mistake, I never suggested, in a corporation anyway, voting. It's not about voting. You don't pull your team together and talk about the problem and then vote on it. It's about making sure that the best and most well-informed ideas come to the forefront and that you have a chance to avail yourself of them and their benefit to your own decision-making. In the end, if you're the leader, you're responsible for the decisions, and you have the right and the responsibility to make those decisions. But you'd be a damn fool if you didn't listen to the people that really are the stakeholders and the experts.
Yeah.
So that's what that's all about. That's one of the reasons I admire Lincoln. The last one, by the way, is that he was visionary. Leaders have to be visionary. Managers deal with the present. Leaders deal with where we're taking everybody, which is, in a sense, the future. Great leaders always have a vision. They're taking the people that they're responsible for in the direction of their vision. And by the way, that vision has to be a vision that your followers find beneficial, both to them and to our community or our world, our environment anyway, our context. And that's what motivates people, I think.
Yeah.
Having a vision.
I actually think it actually inspires them. That's really great. The motivation, the inspiration, all of that is perfect. And what you just been sharing there is, I've been taking so many notes. Ken's looking at me going, he's taking notes. So I'm writing a lot down here. Ken, the show here is called Leadership is Changing. When I say that title or that statement, what does it mean for you?
Well, it's changing in good ways and in not so good ways, at least in my opinion. There are different things that are driving leadership changes in the world today. Obviously, one of them is technology. Technology is changing our lives in so many different ways. And it's obvious, I know. The second thing is that globalization has changed our lives. We may think we've gone too far with it. That's a debatable topic, but it's definitely true that globalization has changed the world. We now have to deal not just with our own country, we have to deal with all of the other countries in the world too, because they're in constant contact with each other, and they're all having an influence on the whole. So it's a different environment totally. I'll tell you a quick anecdote on the side here, and that is that allegedly, at least, it's widely believed, it's apparently documented, that while Lincoln was president, Qianlong, who was the emperor of China, sent an emissary to Washington, D.C., and the purpose was to explain to Lincoln that China ran the world and that Lincoln reported to the emperor. And Lincoln was a man with a keen sense of the big picture. And he realized that this was just a question of face and that it wouldn't have any material impact on him anyway. So he agreed. He said, "You're right. Qianlong does run the world, and we do report to him here," and sent the emissary back. The problem is that today that's no longer the case. You can't just send the emissary back and blow it off. In other words, we live in a highly interdependent world, whether we want to or not, and it's of our own making, I guess, but who knows? And those are things we have to contend with. They're not inherently bad or good, but they are just there. Now there's a couple of other things that I think we have to contend with that are probably inherently not so good and make things more difficult today than they might have been 30 years ago. One of them is that there's been a great polarization of wealth in our world. And most countries are slowly becoming oligarchy. I've never pronounced that word right, but run by a handful of billionaires. Mm-hmm. And then lots and lots of people who are actually getting, in terms of buying power, slowly less wealthy as opposed to catching up. A lot of our factory workers have been relegated to driving rideshare because our factories have disappeared. And this polarization of wealth changes the equation quite a bit. And it results in many people now yearning for, as opposed to 30 years ago, yearning for leaders who will enable them to self-actualize, if you will, whether they knew that was what they were doing or not. Now, more and more, we have people who are yearning for leaders that will protect them. Mm-hmm. And that requires or results in a different kind of leadership. That's, I think, something that needs greater exploration, and I'm not in a position to do that. And the result is we're getting a lot more autocratic leaders in the world today. But many, many people are feeling that they've been left behind and are yearning for autocratic leaders who will, they believe, lead them to a better life. Who knows? But those are the significant changes I personally see taking place. And I do believe that it's resulting in a different kind of a leadership.
Yeah, definitely. And you know how you said earlier on as well about the technology as well, and globalization and so forth, and people looking for leaders probably to protect them, so it's a little bit different. Today, I find the world is getting faster as well. It's getting very fast.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So what does a leader need to be mindful of nowadays to be successful in a fast-changing world?
Well, I think a leader has to have a lot more input. It has to get input from a larger number of sources, because leaders ultimately need to be, they're not going to be capable of being cutting edge technologically, but they at least have to be not just conversant with, but understand the implications of the latest big developments in technology to a much greater extent than would have been true before. And you're right, the pace of change has picked up considerably and will continue to pick up considerably. It seems as if there's no stopping the increase in the velocity of change. I also think that leaders have to be more capable of seeing the big picture. To the extent that they can't see the big picture, I don't think that they can provide value to any of their constituencies, neither employees nor customers nor their communities and the environment around them.
And Ken, I think
so. It's a totally different situation.
Yeah, good points. And I think that on the big picture side of things, it's not only seeing it, but also sharing it, helping people understand that big picture as well. Would you agree?
That's right, because your employees in particular or your followers, if we're not talking about employees, technically speaking, are depending on you to interpret the world for them. They want you to be, all followers and employees are in that group as well, want to have leaders that they consider benevolent on the one hand, but on the other hand, also protective of their own interests. And all of them want to have leaders that are smart and understand the way the world works today and understand the technologies that drive it. The demands placed on leadership are so much greater today than would have been true even just a few decades ago, I think.
Very much so. You mentioned earlier on about employees and what they're looking for with leaders and so forth. Has the employees, because we've been talking about through the lens of a leadership lens, if we were to change lenses now and talk about it from an employee's perspective, has their expectations of leaders changed at all?
I think so. I do. I think that one of the things that I found extremely important in the past, and I still believe is very important, is that leaders should behave in a way that can be copied. I want to explain what I mean by that. People in the past have wanted their leaders to behave in a way that if everybody were to emulate those leaders, the world would be a better place. And I don't know that that's as true today. It feels like the emphasis has shifted a little away from, I want to admire you, to, I'd like to admire you, but in any case, I want you to protect me. I think that's an evolution that has taken place. But if we roll back the clock to when I was more in a leadership position, I really felt that it was extremely important that I behave in the way that I was hoping our employees would behave. Because number one, if I didn't, but I still required it of them, they would become cynical and mistrustful. And the other thing is, people subconsciously follow leaders. They don't even know they're doing it. But you can experiment on your own. If you are perverse enough to experiment, start coming in late every day. Everybody else will come in late every day. Start playing with your iPhone during meetings. Everybody else will feel empowered to play with their iPhone during meetings. If you are respectful of the other people around you, your followers and your employees will act respectful of other people around them. And if you're disrespectful, they'll act disrespectful. It's not even a conscious thing. They're not setting out to copy you. But your behavior provides them subconsciously permission.
Yep. And it goes back to what you said earlier on as well about being the role model, right? It's about the walking the talk and so forth. I'll give another quick example. We were in an event with Hewlett Packard. There was probably 65 senior vice presidents in the room, and even vice presidents actually. So the vice presidents, senior people, and at the back of the room we had some support people helping us with certain things. And I'll make sure that no one's got laptops open in the sense of the participants. But I also asked the support team not to have their laptops open or be on their phones. And they said, well, how come? I said, because we are giving them permission to do the same without us even saying it, right? And that's what you have been saying there. That's a subconscious thing, and people are following leaders. So listeners, we've got to be mindful of the way that we show up, the way we do things, because if we are thinking that, they won't notice or they won't see me doing it, they do. And so we've got to be very, very, very careful in what we're doing there. Ken, you've been talking about, so we go from Abraham Lincoln and we're talking about your dad as well, 60s, 70s, organizational behavior and so forth. If I was to get your crystal ball out now and think about the future, where do you see leadership being in 5 years?
Oh my gosh, that's probably the most difficult question you've posed. I don't think that the trajectory that we're on, as I see it globally, is sustainable. So I think that we're going to have to change things in a way that allows us to exhibit the kind of leadership that we extolled in the past. And here's what I mean by that. We've got to deal with the polarization, because to the extent that you polarize, particularly in a world where everybody has access to knowledge and they realize that they're losing ground rapidly vis-a-vis another group, that is simply not a sustainable long term. 300 years ago, you could behave that way. You could have the ultra rich and the, in relative terms, poor. And there was, of course, there ultimately would be rebellion. But it wasn't, people weren't knowledgeable enough of what was going on in other spheres to be incited to rebellion on a regular and ongoing basis. But now people become really unhappy if they're not treated fairly. And personally, I support that. I think that's reasonable and makes sense, and it's the way the world should be. But I don't think that the trajectory we're on, where the divide between these various socioeconomic groups is increasing rather than decreasing, is going to be sustainable long term. So that doesn't really answer your question. But I do think that the extent of that divide determines the style of leadership that will arise.
Yep. And also think about what you said earlier on as well. I think there's this big thing out there whereby the ability to have a robust discussion about something, and you've got your views, I've got my views, but actually respecting each other's and listening to each other, rather than saying, no, it's my way, and if you don't like it, I hate you, I don't want to know you. That's what seems to be happening today. So we've lost that ability to have that kind of discussion, respect each other, and that's what you were talking about before. And I think that's going to play a big part into what you just shared there.
I think that's exactly right. And the best stance for people to take is intellectual curiosity around the other person's opinion, trying to understand that it doesn't mean you have to accept it. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. But if you're not willing to try to understand it, it ultimately comes to blows, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Ken, it's been brilliant talking to you today. Thank you. Ken, where should our listeners go if they want to get hold of you?
Best thing probably is to write me an email. My email address is redmga56@gmail.com.
Excellent. Well, listeners, we'll put that into the show notes, so that'll be all good. So, Ken, thank you so much for joining me today. I've taken lots of notes, and I know the listeners will be taking a lot of notes and getting a lot out of this episode. So thank you so much for being a guest on today's show. There you go, listeners. So, well, it's about leading through culture, and it's about building a sense of team spirit. Does your strategy, it actually speaks to the mind, where culture actually speaks to the heart? Are you a person that's going to build that? I don't know. It's up to you. But I think something that Ken has shared with us today, and that is about being curious as a leader. If you can be curious to learn more, get input from others, have great debates with others, you as a leader, your organization, and your customers will all grow. Hey, it's great being with you again. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.